Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to reading from Brilliant as the Sun, retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Part 1, Vidur's Pilgrimage. We're going to read Chapter 4, Krishna's Departure. Uddhav describes how he met Krishna just before the Lord's departure and how Krishna instructed both him and sage Maitreya. As Uddhav ended his description of the Yadu's demise, Vidur buried his face in his hands. His body shook with sorrow. Gradually he composed himself and said, "How could this happen? All these great heroes were Krishna's family members. They were his servants, sons and grandsons. How could they be slain in Krishna's presence?" Verse 3 from chapter 4 now. Uddhav said, "My dear friend, know this to be a display of Krishna's potency. By his will, the spiritual energy arranged this spectacular drama so that common people would think that Yadus died at each other's hands. Krishna, however, knew the truth. His family members were either his own incarnations or gods from the heavenly planets. Before dispatching them to their respective abodes, the Lord arranged for them to go to the holy place of Prabhas. There they performed religious rituals and ate and drank to their heart's content before returning to their various planets." "What about Balram and Krishna?" asked Vidur. "Did they also depart?" Uddhav replied. "After the dramatic departure of the Yadus, Balram sat on the shore of the ocean and, meditating on Krishna, returned to his eternal spiritual abode. Then Krishna went to the bank of the river Saraswati, sipped water, and sat silently beneath a fig tree. Verse 4. Uddhav fell silent as if stunned. A few moments passed, then in a wistful voice he continued, "The Lord always removes his devotees' unhappiness. Knowing that his disappearance would distress me, he previously instructed me not to go with his family to Prabhas. He told me to go instead to Badrika Ashram. He knew that by hearing and chanting about him in the association of Nara and Narayan, my painful feelings of separation from him would be assuaged." Vidur asked, "Did you know why he had planned the trip to Prabhas?" Verses 5 and 6 now. Uddhav looked down dolefully for a few moments. Then he softly replied, "Yes, I knew his intention, but I could not bear the thought of separation from him. Therefore, after the other Yadus had left Dwarka, instead of going to Badrika Ashram, I followed him. When I arrived, I saw my lord, the shelter of the goddess of fortune, sitting with the sage Maitreya on the bank of the river Saraswati." Verse 7 now. Uddhav began to perspire and his body trembled. Envisioning Krishna, he closed his eyes, his voice assuming a deep, ethereal tone. Krishna's blackish body is eternal, full of bliss and knowledge, and extremely beautiful. Like we say, Satchid Anand Vigraha. His eyes are peaceful and reddish like the rising morning sun. I could immediately recognize him, the supreme personality of Godhead, by his yellow silk garments and his 4 arms. He was decorated with the symbols of the Godhead. The auspicious Shrivatsa curl of hair decorated his chest. The famous Kaustubh jewel hung from his neck. His body was draped with flower garlands, and his embodied forms of his personal weapons hovered around him. Vidu leaned forward, eager to hear Uddhav's account of his meeting with Krishna. Verses 8 and 9 now. Maitreya made his way toward the river Saraswati. He had been traveling for many days and desired to take bath and refresh himself. As he came out of the woods near the river, he suddenly saw Krishna seated beneath a young fig tree, his right foot resting on his left thigh. Completely forgetting his fatigue and thirst, the sage sat nearby, his eyes fixed upon Krishna's face. Verse 10. Shortly thereafter, Uddhav arrived at the scene. He too was tired from his long trek and was anxious to find Krishna. Smiling at him, Krishna beckoned him to sit beside him. Uddhav felt a surge of love in his heart. He hurried over and fell at Krishna's feet. Verse 11. After welcoming him, Krishna said, Uddhav, in a previous life you were one of the 8 celestial Vasus. Along with other administrative gods, you performed a sacrifice, praying to become my associate. As a supersoul, I understood your desire, which is to perform sacrifice for worldly gain and ascetic achieved by others. Maitreya, who was seeking liberation, listened attentively as Krishna spoke. He became conscious that it is better to become the Lord's personal associate. Verses 13 now, 12 and 13. Krishna continued, Dear Uddhav, this will be your last birth in the material world. For in this life you have attained my complete mercy. Since with unwavering devotion you have sought me out in this lonely place, I will narrate to you the Srimad Bhagavatam which I previously spoke to Brahma in the Padma Kalpa. At the beginning of creation. By hearing this Srimad Bhagavatam which describes my transcendental glories, you will enter my eternal Vaikuntha planets after leaving this body and live with me forever. Verses 14 and 15 now. On hearing Krishna's affectionate words, Uddhav felt transcendental ecstasy. His voice choked up, his bodily hairs stood erect, and tears flowed from his eyes. Clasping his hands together, he falteringly replied, By worshipping you, a person can achieve whatever he wants, even worldly happiness or liberation. But I am so happy serving you that I no longer desire anything else. Now verse 16 of this chapter 4. Uddhav told the Lord that he felt the greatest transcendental bliss when hearing, discussing and remembering Krishna's pastimes. However, he feared that after Krishna's departure, the non-devotees would cast aspersions on the Lord. They would dissuade innocent people from the path of bhakti by pointing to contradictions between the Vedic teachings and Krishna's pastimes. Hearing such foolishness would greatly distress Uddhav. He asked Krishna to personally explain these contradictions. My Lord, the Vedas say, the Supreme has nothing to do. I know that even in the creation, maintenance and destruction of the material cosmos, you do not personally act, but your will is affected by your energies. So how is it you personally acted in so many ways during your earthly pastimes? For example, you killed numerous demons in Vrindavan, you lifted Govardhan hill and you drove Arjun's chariot. Uddhav expressed one doubt after another. You told Arjun that you are unborn, and yet it appears that you took birth as a son of Vasudeva and Devaki. How is this to be understood? You control invincible time, feared by all. Yet, as if afraid, you fled from the battle with Jarasandha and took shelter of a sea fortress. You are self-satisfied, and yet you enjoyed married life with many women. All of this is bewildering. Verse 17, remembering the times Krishna asked him for advice. Uddhav almost broke down. Almighty Lord, it is bewildering how you, whose knowledge is always perfect and complete, should consult with me on matters of policy, as if unsure what to do. Maitreya listened intently, for he too had these doubts. Verse 18, folding his palms, Uddhav petitioned Krishna, "My lord, if you think I am competent to understand, kindly reveal to me the transcendental truths about yourself that you previously taught Lord Brahma. By understanding this, I will be able to cross the ocean of suffering arising from your disappearance." Verses 19 to 21 now. The Lord's lotus-like eyes radiated love as he replied to Uddhav. He described confidential knowledge about himself that he had not even told Brahma. After answering Uddhav's questions, Krishna told him to go to Badrika ashram in the Himalayas. Uddhav folded his palms in assent. The best way to stay in Krishna's association was to follow his instructions, which are not different from him. Uddhav respectfully walked around Krishna 3 times and with a grief-laden heart left. Maitreya remained to make further enquiries to the Lord about the nature of his appearance and activities. Walking away, Uddhav turned back to see the Lord deeply absorbed in discussion with Maitreya. Tears streamed, now verses 22 and 23. Tears streamed from Vidur's eyes. His heart was breaking after hearing about the disappearance of all his friends, relatives, and of Krishna himself. He strove to pacify his mind and transcendental knowledge, that which pervades the entire body, you should know to be indestructible. No one is able to destroy that imperishable soul. The material body, however, is sure to come to an end. For the soul there is neither birth nor death at any time. He has not come into being, does not come into being, and will not come into being. He is unborn, eternal, ever-existing, and primeval. He is not slain when the body is slain. For several moments both Uddhav and Vidur sat in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Then with a deep sigh, Uddhav said, "Thus I am on my way to Badrika ashram, where the Lord resides in his form as Narayan, along with the venerable sage Nara. For thousands of years they have performed penance for the welfare of all living beings." Verses 24-25 now. As Uddhav rose to depart, Vidur placed a restraining hand on his arm. Despite being Uddhav's elder, Vidur addressed him respectfully, considering him more advanced in devotion to Krishna. "O Uddhav, the Lord's servants benefit the world by traveling and enlightening others in transcendental knowledge. Kindly therefore show mercy on me and impart to me the teachings Krishna gave you." Verse 26, Uddhav hesitated. He knew that Maitreya, who was his elder, was nearby and equally competent to instruct Vidur. He feared committing the offense known as Maryada Vyatikarma, impertinently surpassing a superior person. So the meaning of Maryada Vyatikrama is not karma. Vyatikrama means impertinently surpassing a superior person. This serious transgression shortened the offender's life and destroyed his opulence, fame, and piety. With folded palms he replied, "O fortunate one, it is better that you take lessons from the learned sage Maitreya. He is nearby and is highly esteemed for his transcendental knowledge." Just before he departed, Krishna also instructed him in order that he might relay those teachings to you. Parikshit listened spellbound, oblivious to hunger and thirst. So, as we all remember, Parikshit Maharaj is listening to all these pastimes from Shukadev Goswami. Verse 27. Now Shukadev continued, Uddhav had been greatly afflicted due to separation from Krishna. After spending the night talking about him with Vidur, he could again perceive the Lord's presence everywhere. As the sun rose, Uddhav left for Badrik ashram. Verse 28. Parikshit appeared confused. How is it that Brahmin's curse destroyed all the Yadus, including, it seems, even Krishna and Balram? Yet Uddhav was unharmed. Verse 29, Shukadev replied, "You should understand that the Brahmin's curse was only a superficial reason for Krishna's disappearance along with his family. The real reason was the Lord's desire. He wanted to end his earthly pastimes after first dispatching his associates back to their respective abodes, but he desired that Uddhav remained behind." Shukadev emphasized that the Lord's body is spiritual and never dies. This gave rise to a further doubt for Parikshit. He had heard that Krishna had left a material body since his form is spiritual. How did he leave a corpse? Shukadev explained that among Krishna's many forms is the Virat Roop, or the universal form, comprised of the material elements. When Krishna, who is the original source of all divine incarnations, appears in this world, his other forms, including the Virat Roop, merge into him. At the time of his departure, all the Lord's forms return to their respective places. The universal form manifests as a corpse, returning into the material elements, whereas the Lord's original spiritual form departs for his eternal abode. Shukadev assured Parikshit that those who regularly hear and chant about Krishna with faith and devotion would understand this truth. The atheists, however, would be baffled. In this way, the Lord conceals his divinity from the faithless, who wrongly think his leaving a material body is proof of his mortality. Parikshit carefully considered Shukadev's explanation. The king knew from his own experience that by hearing and discussing Krishna's teachings, one can directly experience the Lord's auspicious guidance in his life. Krishna himself made this clear to Arjun when he said, "To those who constantly serve me with love, I give the intelligence by which they can know me." On the other hand, he declared that he always hides himself from the non-devotees who can only speculate about the Lord, failing to understand him. Still, Parikshit remained curious as to why Krishna had not taken Uddhav with him. Verse 30 to 31. Shukadev explained that Krishna considered Uddhav the most advanced devotee among all his associates, knowing that Uddhav was never affected by the modes of material nature. Krishna was confident that Uddhav would correctly understand his teachings. Verse 32, Shukadev said, "Krishna, who is the source of all Vedic knowledge and the spiritual master of the universe, instructed Uddhav in knowledge that he had not previously spoken even to Arjun. He then deputed Uddhav to relay that most confidential knowledge of the mysteries of his appearance and disappearance to Nara and Narayan in Badrikashram. Uddhav, absorbed in meditation on his Lord, faithfully executed the order." The last verses of chapter 4, verses 33 to 36. After hearing about Lord's pastime and learning that Krishna had remembered him prior to his disappearance, Vidur was overcome with emotion. Thus he stayed on the bank of Yamuna for a few days to regain his strength before setting off for the Ganges, where Uddhav told him he could find Maitreya. "My dear king, Krishna's pastimes are difficult for most people to comprehend. Only his devotees who are favored by him can truly understand them. For those who, like animals, are only interested in material enjoyment and who envy the Lord simply become confused by such narrations." Shukadev began to describe Vidur's meeting with Maitreya. So, next time we will begin chapter 5, Vidur's talks with Maitreya. Thank you for joining. Ayam Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.